I called him into the office on a Tuesday in March and told him his rate was dropping $4 an hour, effective that Friday. He was standing in the doorway with his hard hat still under his arm, sawdust on his boots from a panel job he'd finished 20 minutes before driving straight over. I didn't offer him a chair. I said the company was tightening up for the season and some rates needed adjusting, and his was one of them. He looked at me for a second, said, understood, and left. That was the whole conversation. 4 words from him, maybe 30 from me. I want to tell you I thought I was being fair. I want to tell you I thought I was running a business the way business gets run. I was wrong about him before I ever cut that check, and I was wrong about him for 6 more months after, and it took losing something I actually cared about to see it. My name is Deb Kowalczyk, 54 years old, Cleveland, Ohio. I run Kowalczyk Electric, a commercial and industrial electrical contracting outfit my father started in 1971 and that I've run since he had his first stroke in 2009. We do panel work, service upgrades, industrial retrofits, the kind of jobs that don't make the news but keep buildings from burning down. I've got a husband who does the books part-time and doesn't ask me questions about the floor, and a son, Nate, 26, who I brought up in this trade the same way my father brought me up in it, meaning I put a tool belt on him before he could drive and told him the work would tell him who he was, because that's what my father told me. I'm going to tell this the way it happened, in order, because I don't think it means anything if I skip to the part where I feel bad about it. I should tell you first who I was before any of this, because I don't think you can understand what I did without understanding where it came from. My father built this company out of a panel truck and a phone number, and the one thing he drilled into me harder than wiring codes was this: you don't hand a man more than he's already proven he's worth, because the minute you do, you've lost the ability to ever take it back. I watched him run crews that way for 30 years. Guys who complained about their rate got their rate cut further, because a man who complains is a man already looking for the door, and you don't waste raises on a man halfway out of it. Guys who took what they were given without a word got kept on, because that was proof, in my father's mind, and eventually in mine, that they understood their place in the order of things. I didn't think of it as cruelty. I thought of it as running a tight operation in a business where margins are thin enough to kill you if you get soft. I'd also grown up around a specific kind of assumption that I never once, in 50 years, thought to examine, because nobody around me ever examined it either. Guys who came up through this trade from somewhere else, meaning somewhere outside Cleveland, outside Ohio, outside the country most of all, got treated, in my father's shop and then in mine, as a different category of labor. Cheaper to start, easier to underpay, less likely to know what the going union rate actually was, or to have the standing to argue about it if they did. I don't think my father ever said it in so many words. He didn't have to. It was just how the shop worked, and I ran it the same way for 15 years without a single conversation forcing me to look at it directly. Elias Okafor started with us 4 years before any of this, in a year when we were short 2 journeymen and needed bodies on a hospital retrofit that was already behind schedule. He came through a temp agency, Nigerian, mid-40s then, with an accent that some of the older guys on the crew made no effort to hide their opinion of. His resume said he'd done panel work and motor controls back in Lagos for almost 2 decades before he came to the States. I looked at that resume for about 4 seconds. I didn't call anyone to verify it. I put him on the crew at the rate we paid unlicensed help doing grunt work, because that was the box I'd already put him in before he ever picked up a single tool on one of my job sites. I want to tell you about my father a little more, because I don't think what I did with Elias makes sense without him. Stan Kowalczyk, ran this company for 38 years out of a two-bay garage on Fleet Avenue before we ever moved to the building we're in now. And he had a saying he used on every new hire, the same words every time. This trade doesn't care where you came from. It cares if the panel's hot when you think it's cold. He believed that sentence with his whole chest. What he didn't seem to notice, and what I didn't notice either for 20 years working under him, was that he never actually applied it evenly. Guys who looked like him, talked like him, grew up 2 streets over from where he grew up, those guys got the benefit of the doubt on day one. Guys who didn't, guys with accents or different last names or resumes from someplace outside Ohio's usual pipeline, got treated like they had something to prove before the sentence applied to them at all. My father would have told you, if you'd asked him directly, that he judged every man by his work and nothing else. He believed that about himself completely. I believed it about myself too, for a long time, running the same shop the same way. I've got a husband, Ray, who keeps the books 3 days a week and stays out of everything else, which is exactly the arrangement that's kept us married 26 years. And I've got Nate, 26 now, who I brought into this trade the way my father brought me into it. Tool belt before a driver's license, told the work would tell him who he was. I wanted that for him the same way it had been given to me. I didn't examine, until a lot later, that the version of the work tells you who you are I'd inherited only ever seemed to apply once you'd already been let all the way into the room. Elias came to us in a slow month, is the truth of it, not a desperate one. We needed bodies for the hospital retrofit, but we weren't drowning, and I could have taken 30 seconds longer with that resume if I'd wanted to. I didn't want to. I looked at Lagos, Nigeria under his work history and temp agency placement under how he'd come to us, and I made a decision about what both of those facts meant that took me less time than it takes to sign my own name. Frank was in the shop the day Elias started, and even Frank, 20 years my senior in this trade, and not a man who ever accused me of much, said, quiet, just to me, "You sure about the rate on him?" Resume reads pretty deep. I told Frank the rate was standard for unlicensed placement, and that was that. And Frank let it go, the way most people let most things go when the person making the call has already made it. Elias didn't say much those first few months, which I took at the time as confirmation that I'd sized him up correctly. Quiet man, did what he was told, didn't push back on assignments even when they were beneath what his resume claimed he could do. What I didn't clock, what I flat out refused to clock, because it would have meant admitting I'd misjudged him, was that the panels he wired never came back with a callback. Not one, in 4 years. In a trade where callbacks are just the cost of doing business, where even your best guys get one every few months on something subtle, Elias Okafor's work came back clean every single time. I noticed that. I filed it under Lucky instead of under what it actually was, because Lucky didn't require me to change anything about how I paid him or thought about him. By year 3, I'd started quietly handing him the training. Not officially, there was no title change, no bump in pay to go with it, but when a new hire needed to learn motor control wiring, or a green kid needed someone patient enough to walk him through a panel schedule without losing his temper, I put him with Elias, because Elias was good at it and didn't complain about the extra work it created for him. Over about 18 months, he trained 11 guys who came through our shop. Every one of them will tell you, if you ask, that Elias Okafor taught them more in a month than 2 years at the training center did. I knew that. I heard it secondhand more than once. I still had him on the same rate I'd started him at 4 years earlier, minus one small raise I'd given the whole crew across the board during a good quarter. Because a rate hike specifically for him would have meant acknowledging specifically why he deserved it, and some part of me wasn't ready to do that math out loud. My son Nate was 22 around this time, 3 years into the trade himself, still finding his footing the way every kid does. I'd put him under a few different journeymen to round him out, and for about 4 months in his second year, I put him under Elias. Nate came home one night that spring and said, at dinner, "That guy's the best electrician on the whole crew, Ma. It's not close." I remember exactly what I said back, because I've had 4 years since to be ashamed of it. I said, "He's fine for what he does." Nate looked at me a second too long, the way a kid looks at a parent when he's caught them saying something smaller than what they actually believe, and he didn't push it, and I didn't explain myself, and we moved on to something else at the table. The March I cut Elias's rate, the company was genuinely tightening. I want to be honest about that part, because I don't want to make this sound like I invented a reason out of thin air. We'd lost a bid on a school district contract we'd counted on, and I had 11 guys on payroll and a banknote on 2 new service trucks, and I sat down with the numbers on a Sunday night, the way I always do, looking for 4 or 5 rates I could bring down without gutting anybody's ability to pay rent. I picked 3 names. 2 of them were guys who'd been with us less than a year. Unlicensed, easy math. The third was Elias, and I told myself the same story I'd been telling myself for 4 years, that he was still, on paper, categorized as unlicensed foreign labor. That his rate had room to come down, because it had never really gone up to match what guys like Frank Dolan or Ricky Petrucci were making for comparable seniority. I didn't run the numbers on what he'd actually earned the company, in trained guys and clean callbacks and 11 trainees who could now hold a panel schedule on their own. I ran the numbers on the box I'd put him in the day he walked through my door, 4 years earlier, off a resume I'd looked at for 4 seconds. That Tuesday, in the doorway, hard hat under his arm, sawdust still on his boots, that's when I told him. And Frank Dolan, who'd been on our crew almost as long as I'd been running the place, was in the shop that day, and heard the tail end of it through the open door, and he came into my office maybe 10 minutes after Elias had already left the building. "You cut Okafor's rate," Frank said. "Not a question. Season's tight," I said. "Had to bring 3 down." "He trained half the guys on this crew," Frank said, "including your own kid. He's still classified unlicensed foreign labor on the books," I said. "Rate reflects the classification." Frank looked at me for a long second, the kind of look a man gives you when he's deciding whether the friendship is worth spending on an argument he already knows he's going to lose. "That classification's on you," he said. "Nobody put it there but you." I told him the decision was made, and the conversation was over, and he went back out to the floor, and I remember feeling, at the time, entirely justified, like a woman who'd made a hard call in a hard business and didn't owe anybody further explanation for it. That's exactly the kind of certainty I want you to remember I had, going into everything that happened after, because I think it matters that I wasn't quietly unsure of myself the whole time. I was sure. I was sure for months. Elias said nothing after that Tuesday. Not one word of complaint, not to me, not that I ever heard secondhand from anyone on the crew. He showed up the next morning at the same time he always did, took the same panel schedule he'd been assigned, and did the work at the same clean standard he always had. I remember thinking, watching him from the shop window that Wednesday, that I'd read him exactly right. A man who took what he was given and didn't make trouble about it, which is precisely the kind of employee my father had always told me to be grateful for. I didn't yet understand that quiet and acceptance aren't the same thing, and that a man can decide something in silence just as completely as a man who slams a door on his way out. The tightening that led to the rate cuts wasn't only about the lost school bid. There was a second piece I haven't told you yet, because it's the part that actually put me back in Elias's path before I understood I'd already lost him. That same spring, Nate got hurt on a job. Nothing catastrophic. A fall off a ladder on a service call that broke 2 fingers and put him on light duty for 6 weeks. Unable to run a crew of his own the way he'd started to that year. I needed someone to cover his scheduled jobs without dropping quality, because the clients on Nate's book were exactly the kind who'd walk at the first sign of a callback. I put those jobs on Elias's schedule without a second thought, on top of his existing load, because I already knew, even 4 years into underpaying the man, that his work was the one thing in the shop I never had to double-check. I want you to sit with that a second, the way I eventually had to. I trusted his hands with my own son's clients completely, without hesitation. The same month, I was calculating how many dollars an hour I could take off his check. Those 2 facts sat right next to each other in my head for weeks, and I never once let them touch. He covered every one of those jobs clean, on top of his own load, no complaint. The same 6 months, he said nothing about the rate cut either. I remember thinking, at the time, that I was lucky to have a man that reliable. I didn't think, not once, about what it might cost a person to be leaned on that hard by someone who'd just told him his labor was worth $4 an hour less than it had been the week before. 6 months went by. Nothing seemed different on the surface. Then, on a Thursday in September, 4 journeymen and 3 apprentices, every single person Elias Okafor had personally trained over those 18 months, 7 people total out of an 11-man crew, walked into my office, one after another, over the course of that one morning, and each of them handed me a 2 weeks' notice. Frank wasn't among them. He'd trained under my father's generation, not under Elias. But every one of the 7 who were gave notice that same day, within about 3 hours of each other, like something had been coordinated, though when I asked each of them directly, not one admitted to comparing notes with the others. The last one to come in was a kid named Sam Ruiz, 23, who Elias had spent 4 solid months teaching motor controls to the year before. Sam stood in my doorway, same spot Elias had stood in that March, and said, "I got an offer from Holleran Electrical. Elias is running their new industrial division. He asked if I wanted to come with him." So did the other 6. I asked him, because I genuinely didn't understand yet what I was looking at. "Elias is running a division? At Halloran?" And Sam said, like it was obvious, like everyone but me had somehow already known, "Deb, Elias Okafor's got a master electrician's license from 2 different countries and 22 years running crews back in Lagos before he ever came here. Halloran didn't hire him to pull wire. They hired him to build a whole division and bring the guys who actually trust his judgment with him." Then Sam thanked me, genuinely, for the 4 years of work, said he had nothing bad to say about the company, and left. I sat in that office a long time after Sam walked out. 7 resignations in one morning. 4 of my best journeymen and 3 apprentices I'd been counting on to carry the next decade of this business, gone in the space of 3 hours. And every single one of them gone to follow a man I'd spent 4 years quietly deciding wasn't worth more than the rate I'd started him at, off a 4-second glance at his resume. I called Frank into the office that afternoon because I needed someone to tell me I was wrong about what I thought I was hearing, and Frank, who'd been waiting 6 months for exactly this conversation, didn't give me that comfort. "You want to know who Elias Okafor actually is," Frank said, sitting down without being asked, which he never did. "Fine. I'll tell you what I know, and I've known some of it the whole 4 years he's been here. Because Ricky Petrucci's wife works reception at the hospital, where Elias's wife is a nurse, and small towns talk, even inside a city this size." Frank ticked it off like he was reading a service report. Plain. No drama in it. He ran electrical crews on commercial builds in Lagos for 22 years before he came here. Master's license there. came to the States because his oldest daughter needed a heart surgery this country could do better than back home, and he needed steady dollars and steady insurance to pay for it. Which meant taking whatever work he could get fast. Which meant a temp agency. Which meant landing here, underpaid, because you looked at 4 seconds of paper and decided that was the whole man. He let that sit a second before he kept going. He spent 4 years here, recertifying every credential this state makes a foreign licensed man start over, on his own time, on his own dime, while training 11 of our guys for free. Because you asked him to, and he never once said no. And every one of those guys just followed him out the door because he treated them better in a training session than you ever treated him in 4 years of paychecks. I didn't say anything for a while. I want to tell you I had some sharp reply ready, some defense of the rate structure, some fact that would make the numbers make sense again. I didn't have one. I sat there with my hands flat on the desk, looking at them instead of at Frank, because it was easier than looking at him. He ever say anything to you? I finally asked. About the rate cut. About any of it. Not one word, Frank said. Not to me, not to anybody, not once in 6 months. That's not a man who didn't notice, Deb. That's a man who decided a long time ago exactly what your opinion of him was worth to him, and it wasn't much, and he just kept doing excellent work anyway. Because the work was never actually for you. I found Elias 2 weeks later, not through the company, through Frank, who gave me an address for a job site Halloran had going on the east side, a new cold storage facility that needed a full electrical build-out. I drove over on a Tuesday, same day of the week as the rate cut, though I didn't plan that, and I stood at the trailer door the way he'd stood at mine, except I took my hard hat off before I knocked, which is a small thing, and I don't know if it means anything, but I did it on purpose. He came to the door in a different uniform, Halloran's logo on the chest instead of mine, and he looked at me for a second, the way you look at weather you already checked the forecast for. He didn't look surprised. He also didn't look glad to see me, and he didn't pretend to be. Deb, he said. Just that. No hostility in it, no warmth either. A fact stated. Got a few minutes, I said. Not really a question. He stepped outside instead of inviting me in, which told me something before either of us said another word, that whatever this conversation was going to be, he wasn't going to have it on ground that was his to protect. He was going to have it on neutral ground he'd chosen himself. We stood by his truck. I cut your rate 4 years, $4 an hour, back in March, I said. I'd rehearsed it some on the drive over and threw the rehearsed version out the second I opened my mouth, because it sounded like exactly what it was, a speech, and he deserved better than a speech. I did it because I had you filed as unlicensed foreign labor and never once bothered to check if that was true. It wasn't true. You ran crews in Lagos for 22 years. You've got a master's license from a country I never asked you about. I priced you like a green kid because of where you were born and what your resume looked like at a glance, and I want to say that plain, because I think you already know it, and I don't think you need me to dress it up. He didn't say anything for a while. A forklift went by somewhere behind him on the job site. I let the silence sit because I figured I'd earned exactly none of the right to fill it. You're not wrong about any of that, he finally said. I want to say something back to you, though, and I want you to actually hear it, not just take it as me being generous, because I'm not being generous right now. I'm being accurate. He looked at me steady. It wouldn't have mattered if I didn't have 22 years in Lagos. It wouldn't have mattered if I'd walked in here with 6 months of experience and a GED. You still would have owed me a fair rate for the work I did in front of you, every single day, for 4 years. My license, my history, all of that. That's not what makes cutting my pay wrong. What makes it wrong is that I did the job. That was always going to be enough if you'd ever actually looked. I didn't have anything to say to that for a second, because he was right in a way that cut past the thing I'd been quietly telling myself since Frank's office, that I'd feel less bad about it once I understood who he really was. He wasn't going to let me have that. He wasn't going to let the size of my mistake get smaller, just because the size of what I'd underpaid turned out to be bigger than I thought. "I'm not asking you to come back," I said. "I don't think I've got any right to ask that. I wanted to say it to your face instead of letting Frank carry it for me a second time." "I appreciate you driving over," he said. "I do. But I'm not going to tell you it's fine, because it wasn't, and I'm not going to tell you I've forgiven it yet, because I haven't decided that. I've got 7 men who left good positions to come work under me because they trust my judgment. I'm not going to make a decision about you that fast either, even standing right here in front of you." He said it without heat, without performance, the same even register he'd used the whole conversation. "You want to actually fix something, fixing it's going to take longer than one drive across town." He went back inside the trailer after that. I stood by my truck another minute before I got in it, and I want to tell you I felt worse than I expected to. But that's not quite it. I felt exactly as bad as I should have, for the first time in 6 months, without any of the padding I'd been giving myself. I didn't try to see him again for 3 weeks. I spent that time doing the only thing I actually know how to do when I don't know what else to do, which is look at numbers. I pulled every job Elias had touched in 4 years, every panel, every retrofit, every callback record, and laid it out against what Frank Dolan and Ricky Petrucci had been paid for comparable seniority over the same stretch. The gap came to just under $31,000, 4 years running, for a man with more license and more field years than either of them. I also went back through our books and found something I hadn't looked for before, because I'd never had a reason to. Every one of the 11 guys Elias trained had a callback rate, post-training, that ran better than the company average, better than mine, if I'm honest about my own numbers from 20 years back. I sat with that for a while. My father used to say the work tells you who a man is. It had been telling me the whole time, I just hadn't been reading it, because I'd already decided the answer before I opened the book. I called a lawyer, not because Elias had threatened anything, he hadn't, but because I wanted to do this in a way that couldn't be mistaken for me buying my way out of an uncomfortable conversation. I had the back pay calculated to the dollar, $31,200, and I had a letter drafted, and then I threw the letter out, because a letter felt like exactly the kind of thing that lets a person avoid saying something out loud. I went to see him again, same job site, same Tuesday habit I hadn't planned but noticed I'd fallen into. I asked for 15 minutes this time, specifically, so he could say no to a number instead of an open-ended request. He gave me the 15. I ran the numbers, I said. What I underpaid you against Frank and Ricky's rates for the same seniority, same 4 years, comes to just over $31,000. I've got a cashier's check for that amount, and I'm not asking anything back for it. It's not a settlement, there's no paper attached, no release you're signing. It's what I owed you, calculated honest. And I should have calculated it honest 4 years ago instead of by what I decided you were worth off a piece of paper. He took the check, looked at the number, and folded it without much reaction. I appreciate the honesty in the number, he said. I do. I want to be straight with you, though. This doesn't undo the 7 men who quit good jobs to follow me. And it doesn't undo 4 years of me recertifying licenses on my own dime while you paid me like I hadn't already earned them somewhere else. Money fixes money. It doesn't fix the rest of it. I know, I said. I'm not here thinking a check squares it. I wanted to ask you something else, and you can say no as easy as you took that check. I told him about the school district contract I'd lost that March, the one that had started the whole tightening in the first place. Cleveland Metro was putting the electrical contract for 2 new elementary schools back out to bid that winter. Bigger scope than anything we'd handled before, and I didn't have the staff left to credibly compete for it anymore. Not with 7 of my best gone to Holleran. I want to bid it jointly, I said. Kowalczyk Electric and your division at Holleran, named as co-lead on the proposal, public, your name on the paperwork same size as mine. Not because I need the staffing, though I do. Because Cleveland Metro should see your name on a contract like that, and they should see it because it's true. Not because I'm trying to make myself look better for saying it. He was quiet a long moment. I'll need to run that by Halloran's ownership, he said. It's not my decision alone to make, and I'm not going to pretend it is just because it'd be a good story if it were. Then, after another pause, if they're willing, I'd want equal signing authority on the proposal, not junior partner language buried in an appendix. Equal. Printed the same size, same page. Equal, I said. I'll draft it that way from the start, and you can have your own lawyer read every line before either of us signs anything. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he's filing something away rather than agreeing to it outright. I'll let you know what Halloran says, he said. I'm not telling you this fixes anything between us either. I'm telling you it's a fair proposal on its own merits, and I'll consider it on those merits. That was as far as he'd go that day, and I understood, driving home, that I hadn't earned anything more than that yet, and wasn't owed anything more than that either. It wasn't one contract that changed anything between us. I want to be straight about that, because I think it'd be easy to tell this story like the school bid was the turn. And it wasn't. It was 18 months of smaller things, most of which he never had to give me, and gave me anyway, slowly, on his own schedule, not mine. The first was small. About 2 months after I dropped off that cashier's check, Holleran's industrial division and my crew ended up on adjoining floors of the same commercial retrofit downtown, different contracts, different clients. No reason for either of us to interact at all. Elias came over on his lunch break one day, unprompted, and pointed out a code violation risk in a panel schedule one of my newer guys had drawn up wrong. Not my crew's contract, not his responsibility, no obligation to say a word. He told me plainly, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because somebody's going to get hurt on that floor if it goes in wrong, and I'd rather tell you now than read about it later. That was the whole exchange. He didn't stay to chat. But it told me something. That whatever he'd decided about me personally, he hadn't let it touch the actual standard he held for the work itself, and he wasn't going to let a bad panel schedule sit uncorrected out of spite toward me. The second came about 5 months in, when Sam Ruiz, one of the 7 who'd left with him, reached out to ask if Kowalczyk Electric would be willing to take him back part-time on weekend service calls, since Halloran's schedule didn't always have enough hours for him yet. I called Elias directly before I said yes to Sam, because I didn't want to make a move that looked like I was quietly trying to pull his people back one at a time. Elias's answer was short. Sam's a grown man. He can work wherever he wants on his own weekends. I'm not going to tell him no, and I'm not going to thank you for asking either. Though I notice you did. I took that for what it was, not warmth, but a kind of fairness he was extending on principle, whether or not he felt like extending it to me personally. By the 9th month, we'd started ending up in the same rooms often enough. Bid walkthroughs, supplier counters, once a licensing board hearing neither of us had known the other would be at, that the awkwardness of it wore down into something closer to professional ease. He never once brought up the rate cut himself in all that time. I brought it up twice more, briefly, mostly to check whether anything had shifted in how he felt about it, and both times he gave me some version of the same answer, that it wasn't forgotten, that it wasn't something he needed me to keep revisiting out loud, and that he'd judge where things stood by what I did next, not by how many times I asked him how he felt about what I'd already done. The joint bid went in that January, my name and his printed the same size on the cover page, exactly like I'd promised. Holleran's ownership signed off on it inside a week, and I found out later it wasn't a hard sell on their end. Elias had already built enough of a reputation in the 18 months he'd run their industrial division that putting his name forward on a public school contract was, for them, simply good business. We won it that spring. 2 elementary schools, full electrical build-out, the biggest single contract either of our outfits had touched in years. Elias's crew handled the technical lead on the panel design and motor control systems. My crew handled permitting and the trade coordination with the general contractor. Neither one of us could have carried that scope alone, and both of us knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise in front of the school board. It took most of that year working alongside him on job site walkthroughs before he started talking to me the way he talked to Frank, plain, unguarded, about ordinary things, not just contract logistics. I learned things I hadn't bothered to ask about in 4 years of paying his checks. His daughter, the one whose heart surgery had brought him to this country in the first place, was 17 now, healthy, playing volleyball at a public high school on the west side, and Elias coached her travel team on weekends when the job schedule allowed it, which he told me plainly wasn't often enough. And he wasn't going to pretend that didn't bother him. His wife, a Daisy, still worked nights at the hospital, and he still hadn't finished recertifying 2 of the specialty licenses he'd held back in Lagos, because Holleran's schedule, generous as it was compared to mine, still didn't leave him the hours he wanted for it. He wasn't a solved man at the end of any of this. He was a man with an ordinary, unfinished life that had simply kept moving the whole time I wasn't paying attention to it. Nate, my son, ended up on that school job too. One of the few of my original crew who'd stayed after the resignations, and I watched him work under Elias again, 3 years older than the first time, and I watched Elias treat him exactly the way he'd treated him before. Patient, exact, no favoritism, and no coldness either. One evening that fall, wrapping tools after a long day on site, Nate said to me, out of nowhere, "You ever tell him you were wrong?" Straight out, not the check, not the contract. Just tell him. I told Nate I had once, standing by his truck outside the Halloran trailer. Nate nodded and didn't say anything else about it, but I understood he'd been carrying that dinner table conversation from 4 years back, the same way I had, waiting to see if I'd ever actually close the loop instead of just fixing the money. I never got a moment with Elias that felt like forgiveness, exactly, and I want to be honest that I don't think that's coming, and I've stopped waiting on it. What I got instead, over about 18 months, was something plainer and I think more honest than forgiveness would have been. He started nodding at me on job sites the way he nodded at Frank. He started giving me his actual opinion on a design change instead of the careful, minimal answer he'd give a client he didn't fully trust yet. Near the end of that school project, standing in a half-finished electrical room with conduits still hanging loose from the ceiling, he said the only thing close to a summary he ever gave me on the whole 4 years. "I don't need you to feel bad about it anymore," he said. "I needed you to pay it right and treat it right, going forward. You've done that for going on 2 years now. That's not nothing. It's also not something I'm going to call settled, because some things a man just carries, and this is one of mine to carry, not yours to absolve." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anybody said to me in 54 years. I didn't ask him to say more. I understood, standing in that half-wired room, that I'd gotten exactly what I'd earned, no more, and that the getting of it hadn't cost him anything further to give. I don't have a clean lesson to hand you at the end of this, and I'm suspicious of people who do. I priced a man for 4 years off 4 seconds of looking at where he was born, and it cost me $31,000 and 7 of my best people, and a year and a half of a man's basic decency toward me that I hadn't earned back yet and might never fully earn back. He was right the whole time, and he'd have been right even if none of the rest of it turned out to be true. Even if he'd never run a crew in Lagos, even if there'd been no license, no 11 men trained clean. The work in front of me should have been enough on its own. It took losing almost everything I'd built with my own hands to finally read it that plain. If this one hit you the way it hit me telling it, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, hard-earned stories.